V-Dub gang, what's going on? We are back with part 2 of the GTI build. Now before I start the video, I just want to give you viewers an update on some changes that I've done. In part 1, if some of you were reading the comments, there was a conversation about ring gapping. Shout out to the ones who left some feedback and advice. I appreciate the help and knowledge. Thank you. That's what we do. V-Dub gang, helping each other out. Anyways, I've since re-gapped the piston rings. Did a little research and found a small table that I used as a guide to determine the gap. If we take a look at the chart, you can see a bunch of applications. I specifically focused on the street moderate turbo or nitrous application. On this table, it gives you a small little formula that will determine your ring gap. Quick little math on the calculator. The bore diameter for a stock 1.8t is 81 millimeters. You first convert that to inches and you get this value here. Next, we multiply the given value on the table according to your application, which is this value. And finally, we get our ring end gap measurement. Of course, we can't get it to this exact measurement, so I rounded it up. And our final ring gap for the top compression ring comes out to 16 thousandths of an inch. Same process goes for the second compression ring. Do our calculations, we get a ring end gap of 18 thousandths of an inch. This is the final gap we are using for the build. With all that being said, let's get on with part 2. Alright, so last video we left off on putting the piston and rods together. Today we are going to work on getting the internals bolted and torqued down to specs, and at the same time measure our bearing clearances for the main bearings since we are reusing them, and also the connecting rod bearing clearance. Tools for this section, we got our plastic gauge. One green pack is more than enough. Piston ring compressor and a good quality torque wrench. Here we got the block with the crank out. Before we put the main bearings in, we are going to wipe the surface and also the outer surface of the bearing shell free from oils. Make sure you got all your oil spray jets in, torqued to 20 foot-pounds. If you forget these, you will have oil pressure problems and potentially damage your engine. Once they're all in, we can lubricate the inner surface of the bearing shell and drop in the crank. Wipe the top surface of all the crank journals free from oil, because this is where we will use our plastic gauge. Just cut a small strand and place it horizontally along the surface. You want to do all the journals at the same time. Wipe the main caps and bearings from oil as well and place them onto the crank. Now the main cap bolts are stretch bolts, one-time use only, but we need to measure the clearance first, so we are only going to torque them down to 48 foot-pounds and that's it. We're not going to stretch them by doing a 90-degree turn. So we're going to start from the inside and work our way towards the outside. To make sure we are torquing it down evenly, we are going to start off with torquing all the bolts to 24 foot-pounds, then up to 36, and the final spec of 48 foot-pounds. After all that, we will simply unbolt all bolts and check the clearance. Alright, let's just cut a piece of the plastic gauge ruler and we'll measure the clearance. The Bentley calls for a spec of 0.0004 to 0.0016 inches and a wear limit of 0.0059 inches. The wider it is, the tighter the clearance. From what I see, the plastic gauge on all the crank journals is roughly between 0.0015 inches and 0.002 inches, which is well within the wear limit of 0.0059 inches, so we are good to reuse these bearings. With that being said, we are going to go ahead and lubricate the inner surface of the main cap bearings and the journal. Torque the main cap bolts to 48 foot-pounds and then stretch the bolts with a 90-degree turn. The connecting rod bearings are next. First thing you want to do is break loose the rod cap bolts to take them apart. Just like the main cap bearings, you want to wipe down the inner surface of the rod and the rod cap, and also the outer surfaces of both bearings. On both the rod and cap, you will see a notch on one side. Press each bearing into the rod and cap by lining up the bearing with the notch. Very important thing to remember. When you install the rod cap back on, the notch has to be on the same side as the other notch. Do not install them opposite of each other. From here we are going to lube up the bearing on the rod. The rod cap bearing we will leave dry so that we can measure the clearance with the plastigauge. Right now I'm going to show you an example of ring gap clocking. There are loads of different diagrams and ways to do it, and some people say it's not necessary, but I'll show you guys the way I'm clocking the rings. First off, know the orientation of your piston. There are two landmarks and you can't miss them. There's this notch at the top that faces the front of the engine where your oil dipstick is, and also on some pistons they have this arrow etched onto the surface. This arrow points in the direction of the timing belt. It's a little hard to see, so I marked it again on top of the piston. So the first ring we installed was the oil rail spacer, which is part of ring number 3 on the piston. The gap is directly above the wrist pin. Then we did the bottom oil rail about an inch to the right of the oil rail spacer. Then the top oil rail about an inch to the left of the spacer. Next we got the bottom compression ring, which is ring number 2 on the piston. Clock this gap at 120 degrees from the oil rail spacer. And then finally the top compression ring, which is piston ring number 1, 120 degrees from the bottom compression ring. Pretty simple diagram working from bottom to top. Totally up to you how you want to do it. Here's our piston ring compressor. Very easy to use. It comes with a turning key. On this specific tool there is a spring-loaded tab that keeps tension. Simply press it inward and it'll loosen the tension, and with your key you can open it up to the sides of your piston. To tighten, you simply drop in the piston and turn it to the right until you can't turn it no more. Before you put the piston in, make sure the crank journal that you are installing it to is at bottom dead center. That way when you push the piston in, you don't contact the journal, potentially damaging it. Also, it'll be easier to measure your clearance with the plastigauge. So the piston rings are compressed. You want to leave part of the piston skirt exposed so you can guide it into the block. Lube up the walls of the cylinder. I'm just gonna tap the sides of the compressor so that it'll sit flush against the block, and then I'm gonna push this bad boy in. Once the entire piston is in, don't push it any further. You're gonna want to flip your block over it, and now all you gotta do is push the piston while guiding it on the crank journal. Wipe off any oil on the crank journal and the rod cap bearing, and place a piece of plastigauge horizontally across the journal and place the cap on. Don't forget about your notches, same side. Now put in your bolts. Make sure you apply the lubrication to the bolts provided by ARP and hand tighten them. Now according to the instructions from IE and ARP, the bolts need to be stretched to 0.006 thousandths of an inch. Two methods of doing this would be with a stretch gauge or a torque wrench. I don't have the stretch gauge on hand, so we will do the torque wrench method. Pretty simple. It says we need to torque the bolts to spec at 50 foot-pounds 3 times. Meaning, torque down to 50 foot-pounds, then loosen it all the way. That will complete one cycle. Then we torque it down again to 50 foot-pounds and then loosen it again. That's 2 cycles. Then on the 3rd cycle, you torque it to 50 foot-pounds and leave it alone. Do not loosen it again. To make sure we are tightening this down evenly, we are going to start by torquing it to half the spec at 25 foot-pounds, then 35 foot-pounds, and finish it with 50. So that was one cycle. Now we can check our plastigauge. Loosen the bolts a bit and tap the bolts to separate the cap from the rod. Flip your plastigauge ruler to the millimeter side and compare the measurements. As for the connecting rod bearings, the Bentley specifies 0.01 to 0.05 millimeters with the wear limit of 0.09 millimeters. From what I see, the clearance seems to land between 0.025 millimeters and 0.038 millimeters, which is within specs, so we are good. Now simply remove the excess plastigauge with some lube and rubbing it off. After that, we can now lube up the entire journal and the inner surface of the rod cap bearing. Now don't forget, we already did one cycle of torquing the bolt, so we are gonna do 2 more and then put in the other pistons. Do the same process for each piston and check your clearances.
2 hours later.
Alright, everything is in and properly torqued. I'm going to go ahead and crank this a few times to check for any abnormal contact and to get the bearings lubed up. It looks good to me, guys. That's all I have for y'all. Let me know what you guys think. The rest from here is pretty much butter. Still got things coming in. Parts will go on. Mahalo guys for watching, and of course, see you on the next one.